Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this live event. I'm here with John, and we'll get an opportunity to know him a bit more in a moment. But first of all, warm welcome to you. Either join live, watching the recording of this event. We're going to talk about how great negotiation is critical. This is a critical success factor for procurement. And if you join this event, I'm pretty sure that that's what made you interested. And let's find out, a few of the ideas that John has to share with us. But we have already the first comment from our audience. Fantastic. Thank you, Regina, for being the first one. Greetings from Stormy Zurich. How about the other people that are joining us? Where are you connecting from? Let us know. Then if you do have any specific question, remember, this is your live event. John and I are here to help you, answer the questions that are important to you. So we do have a chat on the right side of the screen. Do use it in order to ask us anything which is important. I do have a number of questions for John, but before actually we go into the question, how about asking John to say a few words about himself? John,
thanks, Giuseppe. Thank you, Giuseppe. I wanted to start by thanking you for inviting me along and giving me the opportunity to meet all these wonderful people. So, my name is John Viner-Smith. I'm founder of a small company called Reciprocal Consulting, focusing on negotiation, consulting, but also training. My background, I had a first career out of university leasing aircraft for a living, which I did until I turned 30. My master's degree is from Bordeaux, master's in International Procurement under Gordon Crichton in Bordeaux. And then I began my negotiation career at JPMorgan Chase, managing the HR category for EMEA, and pivoted from there into consulting at AT Kearney and Deloitte. 2011, I did training with a company called the Gap Partnership in negotiation. And having thought I was quite a good negotiator, it was a real eye-opener for me and sparked a passion for the topic of negotiation in me that 15 years later is undiminished. So impactful that I quit my job and joined the Gap Partnership to really dig into the topic of negotiation. Stayed there for a couple of wonderful years as a partner and then moved back to consulting. But from 2018, I've been focused only on negotiation, working with blue chip clients all around the world, helping them solve negotiation problems, not just by training their people, which is incredibly important, but also by looking at the context within which they negotiate. So how does their negotiation capability align with the process that they work with the targets they have, the incentives they're given, so that we can look at this in a broader, more strategic way, but always focusing on delivering bottom line results. So, and I know from Giuseppe's work, that's the great joy of the work we do. It's that it's so impactful.
Fantastic. Now, John, since the topic is procurement, before we dig into the negotiation, in your opinion, what are the major challenges and opportunities facing procurement professionals in 2025?
It's a great question, and there are the people on the call will be in procurement and be very acutely aware of these. But if you look at the polling, if you look at the surveys from the likes of the Deloitte CPO survey, EY CPO survey, it's interesting if you look not just at this year, but preceding years, because you see the themes emerge. And there are things that are constant, and then there are emergent themes. So the top 5, in no particular order, we'll come back to this. Cost leadership and value creation is a constant for procurement. That's largely what we're famous for. But it's not the end of the story, because as the world's evolved and so have we, second priority on this list is supply chain resilience and environmental sustainability and governance, being not just the police of that, but the promoters of that, the people who live those values out in the supply market. And then there's, again, a theme that's it's evolved, but digital transformation and more generally driving operational effectiveness. Another top theme, very, very consistent. And what that means has changed. Now we talk a lot more about AI, but if you look underneath at what the demand is, more is expected from procurement, usually with less resource, and the tools evolve constantly. And that's very exciting now. 4th is cultivating and maintaining stronger stakeholder relationships. I love being in procurement because we sit at the crossing point, the nexus of the interests of the companies we work for and the external stakeholder groups, and also the conflicts within that, the conflicts that are inherent. We manage a lot of those conflicts, and spoiler alert: negotiation is a conflict resolution tool, which is why being ever more conscious of our capability and our ability to negotiate will make us better as procurement people. Because there's no sense hiding from these conflicts. And when we get to our strengths and weaknesses, I feel we're more comfortable with that than others. And then lastly, this is a CPO survey. Common theme, and Deloitte goes back 10 years. Every year, talent development and retention has been in the top 5. So these are the constant challenges. And yes, they evolve and they change. But I believe they'll continue to be constant going forward.
Fantastic. And so let me quickly summarize it for the audience. It's about cost, sustainability, digital transformation and AI, stakeholder engagement, and talent retention. These are the 5 ideas. By the way, if you have any comment, if you disagree, if you think that, there is something else that you see coming up as very important, do use the chat. We see that we have already a question. We are going to come to the question in a moment. Let me first ask you, what are the procurement function already doing well when it comes to their negotiation?
That's another wonderful question. And actually, Regina's question in the chat is part of the answer I would give to this. So what are we already good at? I think we're known and well, sort of famous in the company for our preparation. If you talk to salespeople versus procurement people, they tend to give us a lot of credit for being very well prepared. Now, as procurement people, we know there's an irony inherent in that, which is when it comes to preparing a meeting, very often, if we're going to meet a supplier, we're going to meet 3 suppliers, and they're going to meet one of us. So we feel less prepared than they do, but they give us a lot of credit. And I believe that's largely about, certainly within category management and sourcing, the amount of work we at least intend to put into understanding our categories, to understanding cost drivers and value drivers. And I think that's a strength. Coming to Regina's question, how important is preparation versus being a natural negotiator? This is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but I think you have to be both. There's a wonderful analogy Michael Wheeler uses, Michael Wheeler from Harvard University. Won't go deeply into it, but he talks about negotiation as being like jazz, by which he means a collaborative innovation on a theme to create something. And if you read his work, and I highly encourage you to do so, when he expands on this analogy, he talks about the level of virtuosity and understanding of their art form that jazz musicians have. That's preparation. And what it enables is them to collaborate and innovate and improvise effectively. So yeah, blending 2 questions there, but for Regina, that I think is the answer. I think you have to be both. But it does come to another question, which perhaps is behind yours, which is sometimes we don't act as agile or as improvisational as perhaps we could and we should, because we like to stay within our boundaries because we're very conscious of what they are. So to Giuseppe's question, number 1, I think our preparation. Number 2, I think high functioning negotiation departments have good stakeholder relationships. Foster those relationships, seek to understand what the sources of value are to the people whom we very often represent in the external market. And when that's done well, it's tremendous strength. Where it can be better is sometimes we're a little bit one-sided. Sometimes we could do better at understanding what matters to the other side. And I think we'll expand on that when we get later into the call. I'm sure something will come up. And I think a third area of strength, and sometimes we beat ourselves up about it or hide from this. But again, I talk to a lot of salespeople and we get a lot of credit for what I'm about to tell you, which is in our role as gatekeepers, we're better and more used to being challenging and delivering bad news. If you run a sourcing process and you have, 4 suppliers, you're going to have to break bad news to 3 of them. So 75% of the conversations you have are delivering bad news. That's an oversimplification, but it means we have to get comfortable with that. In a way that in sales, it's very uncomfortable to deliver bad news. So that's a strength for us, not just because we're good at being mean, but it means that we can be direct. It also means we can be challenging and in a way that is very helpful in negotiation. I'm sure we'll talk about what makes great negotiation, but I'm personally not a fan of compromise. I think great negotiation is about finding value for both sides. by not hiding from difficult questions. And I think that strength that is ingrained in us from our earliest points in our career, when we start out as maybe junior buyers with virtually no empowerment, we get very used to having to say no. And it's not a bad strength to have.
Yeah. Now, John, allow me to have a different perspective about preparation, right? You know, I tend to see a lot of differences in the procurement spectrum, right? You know, there are companies that tend to be disciplined and are well prepared and go into the negotiation well. And then, you know, in some company culture, people get lazy. They say, oh, you know, I've been negotiating with packaging supplier for the last 5 years. I know it inside out. Why do I bother to prepare in writing, you know, everything in my head? And that's, you know, maybe boils down, and that's a message probably also to the leaders that are joining this message. It boils down to, you know, putting a process in place to ensure actually, you know, because, you know, preparation is a proactive activity, right? You know, it's not something that you are obliged to do. And sometimes, you know, when we have so much on our plate, then we don't do, but that's where the problem comes, right?
Yeah. And if I could build on that, I should have prefaced or caveated what I said by saying high functioning procurement. But I'll give you an example I think is very, very relevant to your point. I'm coaching somebody right now who's taken on a senior procurement role, and he's too prepared. He's spent many months on analysis with no action, which if you come to the things we're criticized for, one of them is being slow and lacking agility. That's a challenge. And also to your point is absolutely, we can be guilty of preparing just on our own terms. We're going to write the most detailed RFP in the world. And we're going to nail down every point of specification in it, not recognizing that we're closing off all kinds of avenues of value negotiation and leaving ourselves only a haggle on price at the end. So yeah, if I could amend my answer, making time for preparation, definitely a strength, but being prepared negotiators can very often be improved.
Yeah. Fantastic. Very good. So, okay. Just to the people that are joining us, you know, we got 5 of the major challenges facing procurement. We got 3 ideas from John about some of the things that the procurement people do well. Now, where is the potential for negotiation to elevate performance to an even higher level?
Yeah, that's I think there's not, the answer is this is on many levels. The level of the individual procurement person, the organizational level, and even the strategy, the incentives. But if we start at let's look at what we're commonly criticized for. You know, that when we do our 360s in our organizations, what do people say about us that, you know, they're not happy with? The most common one, by a large margin, is an excessive focus. Some would call it a fixation on price above all else. So not enough focus on the other strategic values. That's something that should be addressed. And we've put ourselves in this position, and this is why it works on many levels, because it's easy to criticize the people and say, oh, that person, they only focus on price. But you have to look at, what are they incentivized on? What are they measured upon? Very often, you may have you may have a balanced scorecard approach, but the one thing that's easiest to keep track of is savings, because it's objective, it's quantifiable. And as I think it was Peter Drucker said, what gets measured gets managed. So we can get very, very focused on that to the exclusion of everything else. Can be coming back to preparation. We don't necessarily prepare ways to measure all of the other things that create value in the negotiation. So that's something we need to address. And this, for me, again, is where negotiation comes in. If you look at, you know, the way I will prepare a negotiation with a client, and I know Giuseppe's the same, is we sit down and we look at it in detail and say, okay, what matters holistically? What has value to the other side? What has value to us? What do we bring to the table that they value, and what vice versa? The language I will use is aggregate marginal value in a deal. How do we create the greatest marginal aggregate value in a deal? It's by identifying the things that I can give with low marginal cost to myself that create marginal value for the other side, and vice versa, and recognize that some things are equal and they will be points of contention. This is better prepared negotiation, and that can definitely address that pure price focused thing on a capability level. But then you elevate that and you say, okay, well, let's look at your processes. You know, if the company process is we tender everything through a piece of software that requires us to make everything a multiple choice question, that's as flexible as we can be. Well, that process is probably making it harder for you to negotiate creatively on other points of value. And then strategically, you know, what's the mission? What's the CFO? Or, you know, who does the CPO report to? If it's CFO, what are they targeted upon? That requires a much more elevated conversation, which, coming back to our disruptors, the challenges we talked about, more being asked from procurement. Again, another reason I'm so excited to be in this field is we have to reframe this conversation. So way number one to get better is we have to broaden the focus, but I'm sure that's not news to anybody. Alongside that, I think, is achieving a wider objective with a wider set of company objectives. We talk about stakeholder alignment. We know that it's generally an area of strength, or something we focus on a lot in negotiation. But the fact that improving it has been a priority for CPOs as long as there's been a survey tells us we're not getting there yet. And part of that, in my view, is because we're not necessarily really embracing their objectives. We come in, and again, this is going to sound like criticism, but it's not, because we've both been in this position. As a procurement person, a project comes up, it's above a certain level of spend, so we are mandated to be involved. And then we go in there, and now it's going to take 20% of our time for 3 months. Well, how are we going to dedicate 20% of our time without showing a saving? Our boss is going to kill us for that. Right? So we end up in this very tough situation where, again, an elevated conversation, we have to be able to go to our boss and say, yep, you know what? This is the 5th time we've sourced this complex category. Inflation and the law of diminishing returns apply. Right? The low-hanging fruit were picked by my predecessor's predecessor. We're going to have to create and be more creative. So I may not cut cost this time around, but the reason we're sourcing it is we have a risk to mitigate, or there is new technology which is going to create productivity elsewhere in my business. And those are the things I'm there to ensure we capture the most of, still creating the most value. And that broadens us out. But then we have to understand those goals better. And this, I'm sure Giuseppe will agree, this is already very highly developed in some areas. Automotive, for example. Automotive, if you're sourcing a new exhaust for the next generation of internal combustion engines, the procurement person in that project is as much an engineer as they are a procurement person. So they really understand the holistic picture. I think we have to make that standard across complex procurement. Yeah. And I say complex procurement because one consequence of AI and all this technology is I don't think there's going to be much simple procurement left for people to do within 3 to 5 years. So it's urgent that we get on with this. And then another piece of this, another criticism is we're criticized for being slow to move and not very agile. And again, a lot of that's due to the processes that we have to work with. And they're processes that were invented for good reason. I'm old enough to remember when 7-step sourcing was new. When Tom Slate at Kearney made the chessboard, which is a highly underrated piece of IP, particularly with regard to negotiation. It's much richer than it looks. And the reason procurement became a function goes back to Ignacio Lopez in Chrysler. It was ill-disciplined. So we brought discipline and we brought rigor, and that yielded tremendous value where there was previously indiscipline. And I think we still, in corners of our minds, I'll speak for myself, I cringe at the word maverick spend, and I know it's natural. I know it should be empowering people to do the right things, but part of me still wants control. I don't think that can have a place in the mid-2020s. I think we have to be more about empowering, and I think technology can help us with that, because we don't want a free-for-all. We don't want maverick spend going crazy and all the risks that are entailed in that. But by the same token, we can empower people. We can be better.
Yeah. All right. Before we're going to take the question from Mohammed, let me say a few words about a program that we are running on a virtual basis. It's called High Performance Negotiation and Influencing. And we have experts for some of the leading business schools in the world. We also, by the way, have also London Business School that has joined us. So basically, what's the idea? The idea is that it's a 12-month journey where every month there is a workshop. And these are the trainers which are part of the program. Actually, this afternoon, we have one of the sessions with Francesca Gino. And so the idea is that, you have a variety of different training, different topics, advanced content in the area of negotiation and influencing, and you can choose a la carte the kind of module which are more relevant for you. So you may decide to attend 4 modules, 5 modules, or 6 modules, depending of which are the topics of your interest. And then all participants also get a package for ongoing learning. So in the chat, you have the link to our program. Check it out and see whether that's something that may be part of your development. Now, let's now move to the question from Mohammed, because it builds very much on what you were discussing before. So it shows, right, that these are the topics which are close to our heart. What are the most common negotiation pitfalls in procurement, and how can they be avoided?
Sure. So again, a great question, perennial question, a great question. I'll start with, it relates a little bit to what we just discussed, the focus on price. So in negotiation, we have a tendency in negotiation to default on certain methodologies, RFX, auctions, and they're founded on one principle, which is the principle that people under competition will lower prices. So we tend to focus very heavily on using competition as leverage on price. It's one tool in our toolbox, and it's a way to negotiate, but it's one of many. And the challenge, the reason it's a pitfall, is it's very, very hard to negotiate strategically to create value when you bring everything back to price. And if I've done this myself, I've written RFPs where I've worked for months, literally months on end, to get all the specifications sort of nailed down in collaboration with my internal stakeholder. And I've sent out a request for proposals when really price has been certainly the one that everyone's looked at. And then we've negotiated, and then you fall into certain cognitive biases come into play. And what commonly happens in my experience is my internal stakeholder will say, I want this supplier. They've given the best answers to all the qualitative questions. I trust them. But I want this price from this supplier whose answers to everything else weren't as good. And actually what we've done is we've fallen prey. We've allowed ourselves to be anchored in a very unhelpful way. We become anchored on the price of a different thing, a different proposition. We frame it as, well, it's an answer to our RFP, so it's the same. But qualitatively, it's a very different proposition. But because of the way we set our process up, we haven't given ourselves room to really negotiate all those other sources of value. And that's very common pitfall. It creates problems in the sourcing process. It also creates problems in the stakeholder, the supplier relationship, in which they recognize they're being benchmarked against something that's not the same. We don't necessarily have the value or the language to have that conversation. So perhaps to bridge the gap, there may be sacrifices made or trade-offs made that haven't been fully expressed. And I've worked with enough salespeople to know that they'll look at it and they might not change the specification of their product because they're ethical people. But they might start becoming a bit more optimistic about assumptions they make. Like, well, we had assumed it would take this, but actually if we just assume this will be fine, we could probably make that price. And what we've done is maybe we've achieved a price saving. We've just moved the risk downstream. It's going to come up. It's going to be a difficult conversation. And you're not going to point the finger of blame at anybody, but it perhaps started with the process not being open enough. And I'll come back to Michael Wheeler on that. It's not easy to have this kind of negotiation. It takes longer and more preparation, but you can really solve more problems that way. So that's pitfall number one, perhaps processes that are very much about a single way of negotiating, and perhaps we don't recognize it. The second pitfall, in my view, is we tend to separate sourcing from supplier relationship management. They're two different disciplines, two different teams sometimes. And I don't know if you've heard, I used to hear this a lot in my negotiation career, my procurement career, excuse me. Oh, we've done the sourcing. Now we're going to throw it over the wall to supplier relationship management. It's done. I've done my piece. Now it's just going to be fine. And they have a relationship to manage. And all those risks we talked about, coming out from the sourcing process and perhaps bad assumptions, not optimism, or maybe even a little bit of cynicism, they get moved downstream. And then they cause the problems that are completely easy to anticipate. So we need negotiation capability downstream as well. And that can get challenging, because I've seen this more than once, and I'm sure you have too. Problem arises in a long-term relationship or a complex project. And perhaps there's something in the contract about a penalty clause. But it's very hard to show who's really at fault, because the root cause is complex and interdependent. And it can rapidly deteriorate into a bit of finger pointing in the blame game. All sorts of factors come into play. There's a different discipline around negotiating that, but the separation of the two is not helpful, because if you've got an SRM person and the root cause of what they're dealing with is a different department, now they're going to struggle to negotiate with each other. So I would say having a more holistic view of a lifetime of a project is useful in that regard. And then one last thing it's really helpful for is we can struggle to achieve and maintain the trust of our strategic relationship partners. And I believe a lot of that is attributable to a kind of cognitive dissonance, which comes from the same problems I've already discussed. And it looks like this. Let's say we've got a long-term partner in a strategic field. They do something quite important for us as a business. And our SRM people are saying to them, or our procurement person with our SRM hat on, are saying, you're valuable to us, you're strategic, bring us your innovation, dedicate your best people to our account. If I can have your home number, that would be fabulous, because, you're my trusted advisor and you're my partner and I want to be your strategic client. But just so you know, I am going to tender you in 3 years, no matter what. There's actual business reasons why that's difficult. But just from an emotional point of view, it's hard to trust somebody who threatens you. And I'm not saying we should be entering into, evergreen contracts with all of our suppliers, but the 3-year rule is a rule we set as procurement for good reason at the time. And it's appropriate in some categories, but not all categories. And I think, to come back to Mohammed's question, perhaps what I'm getting at here is we just need to recognize that we need flexibility. A rule that's perfectly applicable if we're buying pallets, probably not applicable with the people who are running our pension plan. And if we can start, without making it a free-for-all, if we can start capturing and codifying those differences and finding ways to address them, which I know I'm biased, but I think it's largely about negotiation process and capability, I think that helps us address a lot of these deep pitfalls. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great point, John. Our time is running out. Let's take the last question. We take again a question from Regina. You spoke about over-preparing. There are plenty of people who say they never have enough time for preparing. What is your advice to find the golden path, depending on the size of the contract?
Cool. I think this is such a cliche, and I've already said it on the call: preparation, 90% negotiation. What it does not mean is that if you have a 1-hour meeting, you're going to spend 9 hours in a room getting ready. For me, it's about immersing yourself in your category, understanding, talking to stakeholders, internal, external, following the news, knowing what's happening, the cost, all of that stuff. That's all building a well of information, and then which prepares you for negotiation. And then when you have a negotiation coming to you, then it's about applying a certain amount of time to apply that information, to crystallize that information, assess what's relevant, what are the gaps in your knowledge about your own position, about their position, about context, plug those gaps and make it actionable. Good negotiation training, and I've seen a lot of good negotiation training, we'll talk about a process for marshalling information to understanding, right, what's going to be the context? What are the variables I'm negotiating here? what are the parameters? If there are breakpoints, what's good look like? What's bad look like? What are my steps on the way? And what is the marginal cost and value impact of those steps? And the same for the other side. Like, what does it look like for me if they give me more of variable X and variable Y? What does it look like for them? Is variable X cheaper for them than Y? Do I care? All that sort of thinking. That's when, and that can be quite crisp. That can be done, again, coming back to how we need to innovate. We need to be more agile. You can prepare a very complex negotiation in a 2-day sprint if you have all the people present and you leave yourself a bit of time afterward to validate and test assumptions and plug gaps in knowledge. But the 80-20 rule applies. You can get 80% of the most complex negotiation done in a 2 or 3 day sprint if the right people are there, dedicated to the task, with a process, perhaps a professional facilitator to get you there. And of course, everyone recognizing they need to be experts in their field. But that tends to be, I feel, a given.
Fantastic. John, thank you very much for sharing all this wisdom with us. And thank you for the audience for joining us and asking questions. And look forward to reconnecting with you soon for our next live events. And by the way, if you're interested, to get some extra training, then remember that there is always our high performance leading edge negotiation program, where you will have the opportunity to do a 1-year-long program with some of the leading experts in the field. John, was a pleasure to interact with you. All the very best. And thank you for the audience.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.